While most trains in Victoria can travel to pretty much anywhere across the state, tasked with either carrying passengers from A to B or heavy haulage of freight to different cities, interstate train travel from Victoria to outside the Victorian borders can in fact be possible. So in today's video, we have a look at the history behind Victoria's only interstate trains, the Overland from Adelaide to Melbourne and the XPT from Sydney to Melbourne. The XPT, however, was not the first train to run between Sydney and Melbourne. Before that, you had the Spirit of Progress. The Spirit of Progress made its first service on 24th of November 1937. However, it didn't run all the way to Sydney until 1962. It previously ran between Melbourne and Albury on the once standard gauge North East Railway line in Victoria. The Spirit of Progress once features air-conditioned steel carriages, and operating the train was Victorian Railways 3-cylinder S-Class 462 steam locomotives. However, in 1952, deliveries of the B-Class diesel locomotives commenced, and the new locomotives quickly proved their superiority to the steam traction in availability, reliability, and cost-effectiveness of operation. And so in September 1954, the S-Class steam locomotives were all withdrawn from service and scrapped. Not much changed until 1962. On April 16, 1962, veteran A2 class steam locomotives number A2995 and A2996 hauled the final broad gauge Spirit of Progress from Seymour to Melbourne. This had followed the completion of the standard gauge line between Melbourne and Albury in April 1962. That way, the Spirit of Progress finally ran to Sydney from then on. At the same time, on April 13, 1962, a new train known as the Southern Aurora was introduced. Also running between Sydney and Melbourne, it was a night service running every night in each direction. However, tragedy struck on February 7, 1969 when the Southern Aurora, on its way to Sydney, collided head-on with a northbound freight train, resulting in the destruction of 2 S-Class diesel locomotives and 7 sleeper carriages. After that, everything went back to normal until 1986. With declining passenger numbers, it was decided to combine the Spirit of Progress and Southern Aurora into one train, the Sydney to Melbourne Express. The Southern Aurora and Spirit of Progress ran for the last time on August 2, 1986. In August 1981, the XPTs were finally on their way. The first XPT power car and passenger car commenced testing. At the time of testing, the initial XPT livery was red, black and orange with Intercity XPT sign writing on the power cars. On September 6, 1981, while on a demonstration run to Albury, the XPT set a new Australian rail speed record of 183 km per hour between Tabletop and Girrawguree in southern New South Wales. And so from 1981 to 1993, more and more XPTs were introduced. Approximately 60 XPT passenger cars and 19 XPT power cars were built. These days, a typical XPT train consists of an XPT power car on one end and 5 XPT passenger cars and another XPT power car on the other end. CountryLink was formed in 1989, and from then on they were the new operator for the XPT. Although whilst CountryLink also operated the XPT, they also operated bus services to parts of New South Wales that were not served by train. And so from 1992 to 1993, the XPT passenger cars and power cars were all refurbished. This refurbishment would also include a new CountryLink livery. Although the first XPT ran to Melbourne in 1985 and the second one to Melbourne in 1990, it wasn't until 1994 when regular XPT service to Melbourne was introduced. Prior to this, these trains only ran to Sydney, Brisbane and Albury. The XPT reduced travel times between Melbourne and Sydney by 2 hours. During 1995, CountryLink tested 3 X2000 tilting train carriages that were originally built in Sweden. As part of the testing, 2 XPT power cars, number 2000 and 2009, were heavily modified for the testing. However, prior to this testing, the X2000 was also exported to the United States for temporary testing with Amtrak in 1992. However, that test proved unsuccessful, and unfortunately the same was said for CountryLink testing. The X2000 train was sent back to Sweden after unsuccessful testing of 8 weeks in Australia. Now back to the XPT. The XPTs were refurbished again from 2005 to 2008, and in 2013, CountryLink and CityRail merged to form New South Wales Trainlink. The Overland was the first ever train between Melbourne and Adelaide, and is currently the only one between Melbourne and Adelaide. The Overland was originally known as the Intercolonial Express, and made its first service on 19th of January 1887. However, back then, the services were slow. A westbound departure from Southern Cross Station at 6:30 am would not arrive at Adelaide until 9:30 pm. From 1907, the brand new Victorian Railways E-Type sleeper carriages would be introduced, as though more of these sleeper cars would be introduced until 1923. From 1907 to 1947, the Victorian Railways was mandated to have a pair of A2 class steam locomotives on the head of the Overland, but in 1926 the South Australian Railways had introduced the 500 and 600 class locomotives for duties that included hauling the heavier train over the 200-metre curves and 1 in 45 grades. In 1936, the Intercolonial Express was given its current name, the Overland. In 1941, Victorian Railways H-Class steam locomotive number H220 was introduced to service. It was intended to haul the Overland, but never entered regular Overland service, and this was because H220's weight exceeded the rating of the track. In 1951, steam locomotives on the Overland would soon be replaced by diesel-electric locomotives, and wooden-bodied passenger cars would be replaced by brand new air-conditioned all-steel passenger cars. In 1985, V-Line's N-Class diesel locomotives were introduced, and they were able to travel the entire Overland route without refueling, and from 1985 to 1995 they were used on the Overland services regularly. However, in 1995, the entire Melbourne to Adelaide line was converted from broad gauge to standard gauge track, and following this, the NR-class locomotives from National Rail replaced V-Line's N-class locomotives on the Overland. This means the entire ride on the Overland from Adelaide to Melbourne currently takes 10.5 hours. Today, the Overland is currently run by a private operator known as Journey Beyond, and makes just 2 return services each week to and from Adelaide.